There comes a day when a woman stops asking, "Why wasn't I enough for him?" and instead whispers, "Why did I ever think he was the measure of my worth?" And from that moment on, nothing about her life stays the same. When you've spent years reacting to every tone, every shift, every breath someone takes, you start to forget what silence feels like. You forget what it's like to actually listen, not to them, but to yourself. And then one day, something inside you just clicks. Maybe it's exhaustion, maybe it's clarity, maybe it's that rare moment when your heart finally whispers louder than the noise around you. Whatever it is, you suddenly realize that you don't have to react to everything that's thrown your way. You don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to explain yourself to someone who isn't even trying to understand. That's the moment you stop reacting. And without warning, you start observing. People underestimate how powerful observation is. They confuse silence with weakness. They think you're retreating when in reality, you're sharpening. You're watching patterns. You're seeing the truth behind actions instead of getting tangled in words. You're noticing who apologizes only when they fear losing you, who gets angry when they can't control you, who panics when you stop playing the role they wrote for you. It's in that quiet space where you pull back and simply watch that everything becomes clear. There's actual science behind this shift. Psychologists call it response inhibition, the ability to pause before you respond. In studies, people who mastered this were calmer, more confident, and far harder to manipulate. And maybe you've lived that. Maybe you've seen how quickly the dynamic changes when you don't respond the way someone expects. When someone tries to provoke you with a cutting comment, and instead of exploding, you just breathe. When someone throws guilt your way, and instead of absorbing it, you hold it in your hands, examine it, and hand it right back. That's not passiveness, that's power. I once heard a story about a woman who'd been in a roller coaster relationship for years. Let's call her Noor. She loved deeply, but she reacted to everything, his cold moods, his hot and cold affection, the days he was distant and the days he was clingy. Every time he pushed, she pulled. Every time he pulled, she chased. She thought that was connection, that intensity was love. But really, she was trapped in a cycle where her reactions kept feeding his control. One day he sent her a message that normally would have set her off. Something passive-aggressive, something meant to get a reaction. But that day, she didn't reply. Not because she was playing a game, not because she was being dramatic, but because she had nothing left to give to chaos. Instead, she put her phone down and went for a walk. She listened to music. She let her heart breathe without feeling obligated to defend itself. And when she returned hours later, she found her phone full of messages, long, emotional paragraphs from him, scrambling, confused, trying to figure out why she wasn't reacting in the way he knew so well. That's the thing. People who rely on your emotional reactions to maintain control don't know what to do when you step out of the script. They don't know what to do when you break your predictable pattern. They don't know what to do when your silence becomes louder than your words. Noor didn't fight that day. She didn't yell. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to fix anything. She just observed. And in that observation, she saw everything she had been blind to before. And maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've found yourself giving emotional CPR to a relationship that flatlined a long time ago. Maybe you've been pouring energy into arguments that never actually resolve anything, arguments where the goal isn't understanding, but control. Maybe you've been drained from reacting to every shift in someone else's mood while ignoring your own. And maybe you didn't even realize how much power you were giving away in those reactions. But when you stop reacting, you take that power back. You reclaim your energy. You step into a space where you can finally see what's real. You start to notice how someone handles your silence. Not the silence that comes from punishment, but the silence that comes from choosing peace. Some people will respect that quiet. Some people will meet you in it, and some will crumble under it because they relied on your emotional intensity to validate their behavior. Silence is not empty. It's full of answers. When you stop reacting, you start hearing the truth, your truth. You start remembering what your heartbeat feels like when it's not racing. You start realizing that not every conflict is yours to fix. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every accusation needs a defense. Not every emotion that someone tries to dump on you belongs to you to carry. And something else happens too. Your intuition gets clearer. It becomes easier to sense someone's intentions when you're not caught in the storm of your own reaction. You start to see who steps forward when you step back. You start to see who respects your boundaries without you having to spell them out. You start to see who only wanted the version of you that they could control. There's a quiet confidence that grows inside a woman who stops reacting. People notice it even if they can't explain it. They see it in the way she carries herself, calm, grounded, unbothered by small things. They hear it in the way she speaks, slow, deliberate, thoughtful, no longer rushing to fill silence or soothe insecurity. They feel it in her energy, strong but gentle, present but not desperate, warm but not burning herself out to keep others warm. And the person who once depended on her reactions starts to feel unsettled, because uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who built security on predictability. When a woman stops reacting, she becomes unreadable, mysterious even, not because she's hiding something, but because she's finally revealing nothing that she doesn't want to. She's no longer emotionally available on demand. She's no longer triggered by old tactics. She's no longer falling into the traps she used to step into blindly. This shift is not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with fireworks or announcements. It's subtle, like the quiet moment before dawn when the world changes without making a sound. One day you wake up and realize that your emotional world is no longer a battlefield, it's a sanctuary. A place where your thoughts can settle, a place where your heart can rest, a place where your decisions are guided not by fear or guilt, but by clarity. You start observing the conversations you once fought to win, and you realize they're not even worth the breath. You watch situations that once consumed you, and you suddenly see how small they always were. You listen to people who once intimidated you, and their words no longer shake you the way they used to, because you've grown, because you've evolved, because you're no longer controlled by emotional reflexes, but by inner wisdom. Observation teaches you something priceless. You can understand people without absorbing their chaos. You can hear them without letting their words define you. You can see them clearly without losing sight of yourself. And the beautiful part, when you stop reacting, life starts revealing who is truly aligned with you. Some will step closer, drawn by your peace. Others will fall away, threatened by it. But either way, you win, because the woman who stops reacting to noise begins hearing the music of her own becoming. She becomes rooted, present, untouchable in a way that no manipulation, no guilt, no pressure can break. She becomes the kind of woman no one can predict, because she's no longer driven by fear, and the kind of woman no one can control because her power no longer depends on their behavior. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she looks at the reflection staring back at her and realizes she's been searching for something she already had, not in a dramatic fireworks kind of way, but in a quiet, almost heartbreaking moment of truth. a moment where she finally sees how much of her life she spent trying to be enough for someone who couldn't even see her clearly. And that's when everything begins to shift, not outwardly at first. It starts on the inside, small, subtle, like the slow turning of a tide. A change that doesn't roar but rises. For so long, she was wired to seek someone's approval. She wanted to be seen as good enough, worthy enough, lovable enough. She wanted to hear the words that would make her feel valued. She wanted his praise, his recognition, his reassurance. And it wasn't because she lacked strength. It's because she was human. We all want to be acknowledged. We all want to feel like we matter. But the painful part comes when you start to believe that someone else's validation is the only mirror that can show you your worth. So she gave, and she tried, and she poured her heart into proving herself. She changed her style because he didn't like bold colors. She softened her ambitions because he felt threatened by her success. She quieted her voice because he said she was too much. She dimmed her laughter because he said she was too loud. She turned pieces of herself down like a volume knob, hoping that somewhere in all that shrinking, she would become the version he wanted. But the truth, a person who needs you small will never applaud your true greatness. There's research that says nearly 80% of people tie their self-worth to external validation at some point in their lives. It's not weakness, it's conditioning. Most of us were raised to believe that approval equals belonging, belonging equals safety, and safety equals love. So it makes sense why she once chased validation like it was oxygen. But at some point, the chase becomes exhausting. You realize that every time you catch someone's approval, it slips through your fingers like smoke, because validation from the wrong person is temporary. It doesn't fill you, it drains you. And one day, something inside her breaks, but in the most liberating way. She realizes she has been standing in front of a door waiting for him to open it, when all along she had the key in her own hand. That is the birth of self-validation, not loud, not glamorous, but deeply transformative. I once knew a woman named Anaya, brilliant, kind, hearted, full of fire she didn't even recognize. But she was with someone who made her feel like she had to earn affection. When she got promoted at work, he shrugged. When she dressed up, he barely noticed. When she shared an idea she was proud of, he dismissed it. And instead of questioning him, she questioned herself. Maybe I'm not that impressive. Maybe I'm not that pretty. Maybe I'm not that smart. But life has a way of whispering truth when you least expect it. One afternoon, she overheard two colleagues talking about her, not in a gossipy, shallow way, but with genuine admiration. They praised her leadership, her talent, the way she carried herself. They spoke about her with respect she had never given herself. And in that moment, she felt something unfamiliar, something warm and grounding. She wondered, why do I trust the voice of someone who belittles me more than the voice of people who actually see me? That tiny spark was all it took. That spark turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into courage. She started affirming herself, not in a loud, arrogant way, but in a steady, grounded way. She started acknowledging her own wins. She started appreciating her own qualities. She started validating her own feelings without waiting for someone to tell her they were valid. And the more she validated herself, the less she needed his approval. That's the paradox most people don't understand. When a woman builds her own validation, she stops running after people who refuse to recognize her worth. She stops performing for an audience that doesn't clap. She stops explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her. Her validation becomes internal. It becomes her anchor. It becomes her compass. Psychologists say that intrinsic validation, approval that comes from within, is the foundation for emotional resilience. It protects you from manipulation. It shields you from toxic patterns. It grounds you when people try to shake your identity. And women who develop this internal compass become incredibly strong, not because they never doubt themselves, but because they don't crumble when someone else doubts them. Imagine a life where you don't wait for a text to feel valued, where you don't wait for someone's praise to feel proud, where you don't need a relationship to feel complete. Imagine a life where you are enough simply because you say you are. Something powerful happens when a woman stops looking outward for validation. She becomes unpredictable, not in a chaotic or confusing way, but in a deeply self-assured way. The person who once relied on her insecurities to keep control suddenly can't grasp her anymore. He can't guilt her the way he used to. He can't manipulate her with silent treatments or backhanded compliments. He can't make her beg for the affection she freely gave, because she isn't seeking his validation anymore. She's building her own. And when a woman builds her own validation, she starts evolving in ways that make controlling her impossible. She becomes bold in her decisions. She becomes grounded in her values. She becomes confident in her choices. She becomes steady in her emotions. She stops chasing potential and starts embracing reality. She stops begging for crumbs and starts expecting the whole table. And the man who once relied on her need for approval begins to feel lost, because he can't predict a woman who no longer fears his disapproval. He can't control a woman who knows her worth doesn't depend on his mood. He can't intimidate a woman who has outgrown the version of herself he once knew. That shift is life changing. It's the moment she stops measuring her value through his eyes and starts seeing it through her own. The moment she stops molding herself to fit into someone else's world and starts building a world that fits her. The moment she stops needing permission to shine. There's a quiet rebellion in self-validation, a rebellion that doesn't scream, doesn't fight, doesn't demand. It simply stands tall. It simply breathes freely. It simply exists without apology, and the world adjusts. When a woman builds her own validation, she becomes the author of her story, the guardrail of her boundaries, the keeper of her peace. She becomes someone who doesn't fall apart when someone withdraws affection, someone who doesn't crumble when someone disapproves, someone who doesn't lose herself trying to keep someone else. She becomes whole. And once a woman becomes whole, she becomes unstoppable. Boundaries, funny how that one word can change a life, not because it's loud or dramatic or poetic, but because it's honest. And honesty, the kind you speak to yourself in the quietest moments, is where transformation begins. There comes a time when a woman realizes that she spent years, maybe even decades, giving people access to parts of her heart they never earned. She realizes she has allowed interruptions, disrespect, inconsistency, emotional half-presence, and broken promises to stay in her life under the disguise of love, loyalty, or patience. And in that realization, she feels something she hasn't felt in a long time: clarity. Clarity that whispers, you don't have to keep living like this. At first, boundaries seem simple. You think they're just statements, sentences, lines drawn in subtle ink. I don't like that. Please don't do that again. I'm not available for this conversation right now. But a boundary isn't real until it's enforced, until you actually follow through with what you said, until you show people that your well-being has consequences, and those consequences aren't negotiable. A lot of women grow up learning how to be accommodating, how to avoid conflict, how to say yes even when their soul is begging them to say no, how to tolerate behavior that chips away at them because they were taught that endurance equals love. But there's a truth life eventually teaches you. Endurance without respect becomes self-destruction. And that's when boundaries stop being optional, they become survival. I remember a woman named Zoya. She had the softest heart, the kind of heart that forgave before the apology even arrived. She was gentle, empathetic, nurturing, everything the world says a good woman should be. But she was also exhausted, drained from always being available, always being understanding, always being the emotional anchor for people who never showed up for her in the same way. Her partner, though she loved him deeply, had a habit of crossing lines, not in explosive ways, those are easy to recognize. No, it was subtle, the kind of disrespect that hides behind jokes that aren't funny, promises casually broken, emotional responsibility casually avoided. He would dismiss her feelings by telling her she was overthinking, too sensitive, or making a big deal out of nothing. And every time she tried to express her hurt, he would twist the conversation until she was apologizing for even speaking. She didn't want to lose him. She didn't want conflict. So she allowed it. She justified it. She told herself it wasn't that bad. She told herself it would get better. She told herself love was supposed to be this hard. But love isn't supposed to make you feel small. One day, after yet another conversation that left her emotionally drained, she sat alone on her balcony. It was late, the kind of late where the air feels heavy and the world feels painfully honest. She felt an ache in her chest, not from him, but from herself, from realizing she had been abandoning her own needs to keep someone else comfortable. And in that quiet moment, she made a decision no more. No more accepting disrespect disguised as humor. No more tolerating inconsistency disguised as busy. No more brushing off her pain just to keep the peace. No more sacrificing her soul to maintain a connection. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity, clean, steady clarity. So she set her boundaries, not as walls, but as doors with locks only she controlled. And the first time he crossed a line again, because people always test boundaries when they're new, something incredible happened. Instead of explaining herself repeatedly or begging to be heard, she calmly said, "I've told you this hurts me. If it happens again, I'm stepping back." He laughed it off, thought it was another empty warning, something she'd forget by morning. But then it happened again, and she stepped back. She didn't argue. She didn't chase. She didn't plead. She didn't try to decode his behavior. She didn't write essays explaining her feelings. She followed through with quiet strength. And that quiet strength shook his world more than any argument ever had. People don't get disturbed when you set a boundary. They get disturbed when you enforce it. And that's exactly what she did. She protected her peace, her dignity, her emotional stability. She didn't slam doors. She didn't deliver ultimatums. She simply removed herself from spaces where love required self-abandonment. That's the thing about boundaries. They're not about controlling the other person. They're about controlling your access, your energy, your emotional presence. You can't force someone to respect a line they don't value, but you can refuse to stay on the side of that line where your heart keeps bleeding. There's research from the University of Arizona showing that people who maintain strong personal boundaries are less likely to be manipulated, emotionally drained, or stuck in toxic relationship cycles. It's not magic, it's psychology. When you establish boundaries, you are essentially telling the world, "I will not betray myself to keep you," and the world listens. People who love you truly love you adjust. People who only loved your compliance will resist. People who loved your silence will panic. People who loved your availability will complain. People who loved the version of you they could control will become uncomfortable. And through that discomfort, truth is revealed. Setting boundaries is not about building a fortress, it's about building a home inside yourself where you don't feel unsafe, where your voice is heard, where your heart is protected, where your needs aren't negotiable. Some people will call you difficult. Some will call you selfish. Some will say you've changed. And they're right. You did change. You stopped bending. You stopped shrinking. You stopped apologizing for having needs. Once a woman enforces boundaries, she becomes a different kind of powerful. Her energy shifts, not in a loud way, but in a grounded one. She becomes someone who doesn't react to every argument, someone who doesn't explain herself endlessly, someone who doesn't entertain situations beneath her value, someone who is willing to walk away, not because she doesn't care, but because she cares about herself too. And suddenly, the person who was once able to manipulate her with guilt or fear finds themselves powerless. The person who used to rely on her emotional labor realizes it's no longer available. The person who thrived on her tolerance realizes that tolerance has expired. They can't predict her anymore because she doesn't respond to pressure the way she used to. They can't control her anymore because her self-worth no longer depends on their reactions. They can't confuse her anymore because clarity has become her guide. What makes boundaries so transformative is that they teach you who is safe to love. They teach you who deserves access to you. They teach you the difference between those who truly value you and those who only valued your compliance. And perhaps the most powerful thing, they teach you how to value yourself. Because enforcing a boundary is not about pushing people away. It's about pulling yourself closer to the woman you're becoming, a woman who knows what she deserves, a woman who refuses to settle, a woman who understands that peace is her responsibility, a woman who will no longer negotiate with anyone who asks her to sacrifice her dignity. This is what happens when she sets boundaries and follows through. She rises, she stabilizes, she evolves. She becomes untouchable in the most beautiful way. There comes a point in a woman's life when she realizes that her growth is not a negotiation. It's not something she needs permission for, and it's certainly not something she should shrink so someone else can feel comfortable. And maybe that realization doesn't come like a thunderstorm. It often comes quietly, like a whisper she can no longer ignore. A whisper that says, "You've spent enough time measuring yourself through someone else's eyes. Now it's time to rise for yourself." For so long, she was conditioned to monitor his reactions like a weather app. If he was calm, she breathed easier. If he was distant, she worried. If he was irritated, she walked on eggshells. His emotions became the thermostat of her peace. And that's a heavy way to live, constantly adjusting yourself to avoid conflict, discomfort, or rejection. It turns your days into analysis sessions. Did I say too much? Did I not say enough? Was that the wrong time? Did my success upset him? Did my dream threaten him? You start calculating your truths like equations, hoping they'll add up to someone else's approval. And little by little, your own life becomes a reaction, not a creation. But then growth happens slowly, steadily, like a seed cracking open underground. A seed doesn't ask the soil if it's okay to grow. It doesn't worry if the other plants will approve. It doesn't fear the sunlight. It just grows, quietly, relentlessly, purposefully, and that's how it begins for her. She starts reading again. She starts journaling. She starts going on walks by herself. She starts reconnecting with her passions, the ones she abandoned because she was too busy managing someone else's comfort. She starts remembering her old dreams, the ones she once placed on a high shelf because she thought love required shelving herself. At first, she grows quietly, almost cautiously, like she's afraid someone will notice. She tries not to take up too much space because she's still conditioned to believe that her expansion might trigger someone's discomfort. And often it does. Growth tends to reveal what's fragile in others. The first time she celebrates a personal win without shrinking, he raises an eyebrow. The first time she says, "I need time for myself," he reacts with confusion. The first time she sets a goal that doesn't include him, he feels threatened. And here's where many women fall back. They shrink the moment they see someone's discomfort. Because for years, they were taught to manage reactions, not pursue their own evolution. But this time, something is different. She doesn't pause her growth to soothe his ego. She doesn't apologize for wanting more. She doesn't dim her light to keep someone from squinting. She simply keeps moving steady, grounded, committed. She realizes something life-changing. His reaction is not her responsibility. Her growth is. There's a psychological study from Stanford that found people grow faster when they set intrinsic goals, goals connected to personal meaning, not when they chase approval or avoid conflict. And that's exactly what she steps into. Once growth becomes internal, rooted in her values, her healing, her dreams, she becomes unstoppable in a way that has nothing to do with anyone else's understanding. She stops wondering how he'll feel if she becomes stronger, happier, more independent. Instead, she starts wondering how she will feel if she doesn't. And that changes everything. I remember a woman named Miriam. She spent years tiptoeing around a man who felt threatened by her potential. Anytime she talked about her ambitions, he would mock her dreams or remind her of her limitations. If she grew, he felt smaller, so he did whatever he could to keep her growth contained. One day, she signed up for a professional certification she had been wanting for years. She didn't tell him. Not out of secrecy, but out of protection. Her dream deserved safety. She studied late nights, early mornings, during lunch breaks. She worked hard. And when her results came in, when she passed with distinction, she cried, not because of the certificate, but because she realized she didn't need anyone's permission to become the woman she wanted to be. When she finally shared her success, his reaction was exactly what she had predicted: distant, unimpressed, laced with insecurity. But this time his reaction didn't stop her joy. It didn't shake her confidence. It didn't make her dim anything. She had outgrown needing him to clap for her. That's the moment a woman becomes unstoppable. Not when everyone supports her, but when she no longer needs them to. Growth isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it means healing old wounds. Sometimes it means leaving environments that limit you. Sometimes it means saying goodbye to versions of yourself that only existed to please others. Sometimes it means walking alone for a while until your energy attracts people who match your evolution. When she focuses on her growth instead of his reactions, she starts seeing life differently. She starts noticing opportunities she was too drained to see before. She starts building deeper friendships based on mutual respect, not emotional labor. She starts setting goals that stretch her, not suffocate her. She starts honoring her body, her boundaries, her spirit. His reactions, whether they're supportive, resentful, confused, or cold, stop being the compass she uses to navigate her life. She becomes her own compass. And when that happens, the man who once controlled her with emotional unpredictability finds himself confused because he can't shake her anymore. He can't trigger her anymore. He can't box her into the small space where her growth fed his comfort. She has stepped out of the cage quietly, gracefully, permanently. The truth is, focusing on growth changes a woman on a cellular level. Her energy becomes different. You can see it in her posture, in the calmness of her eyes, in the way she speaks. She carries herself not with arrogance, but with grounded certainty. She has nothing to prove, not to him, not to anyone. She stops waiting for someone to choose her. She chooses herself. She stops hoping someone will believe in her. She believes in herself. She stops adjusting her dreams to fit inside someone else's limitations. She expands beyond them. And here's the part people rarely talk about. When a woman grows, she becomes unpredictable to those who used to rely on her stagnation. When a woman grows, she becomes uncontrollable to those who depended on her self-doubt. When a woman grows, she becomes unrecognizable to anyone who only knew the version of her that was afraid to rise. She becomes the woman who doesn't need approval to move forward. The woman who doesn't fold when someone is displeased. The woman who doesn't break at the sound of disappointment. She becomes the kind of woman who doesn't follow reactions. She leads with intention. And the most beautiful part, her growth inspires others without her even trying. Her growth elevates the room without her raising her voice. Her growth becomes a quiet revolution, one that spreads through everyone blessed enough to cross her path. She didn't grow to prove a point. She grew because she finally understood her worth. She didn't grow to outshine anyone. She grew because shrinking was suffocating her. She didn't grow to leave him behind. She grew because she was meant to rise, with or without him. And in that rise, she finally becomes a woman who is free, a woman whose life is guided not by reactions, but by purpose, a woman who can look at her reflection and say, with steady certainty, I am becoming the person I was always meant to be. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she stops shrinking herself to make someone else comfortable, a moment when she stops asking for permission to be who she already is, a moment when she rises, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady, grounded strength that can't be shaped, predicted, or controlled by anyone outside her. That moment is transformative. It's the moment she realizes she's done handing over her worth like something negotiable. The moment she knows she doesn't have to fight for space anymore because she is the space, and everything in her life begins to change. It doesn't start with fireworks. It starts with a shift, a quiet but powerful realization burning at the core. A woman doesn't wake up one morning magically confident. She grows into herself. She learns through pain, through lessons, through the weight of expectations that never belonged to her. She learns through experiences that were meant to break her, but instead pushed her toward her own truth. And once she steps into that truth, she becomes untouchable, not because she's hard, but because she's rooted. That's what it looks like when she stops negotiating her worth. It often begins with disappointment. She gives her all, her love, her time, her energy, and someone makes her feel like it's still not enough. Maybe he took her kindness for granted. Maybe he thought she'd always be available, always forgiving, always bending. Maybe he believed she needed him to feel valuable. And maybe for a while she believed it too. That's how these stories usually start, with a woman who forgets who she is because she's too busy remembering who someone else wants her to be. But then something shifts. It could be a moment as small as sitting at her kitchen table late at night, replaying a conversation that made her feel invisible. It could be a memory resurfacing, a time when she used to laugh louder, dream bigger, walk taller. Or maybe someone she loves looks at her and says, "You're not yourself anymore." And she realizes they're right. She starts questioning everything she once accepted. Why did she let certain behaviors slide? Why did she tolerate words that made her doubt her own brilliance? Why did she allow someone else's comfort to be more important than her peace? And she realizes that the version of herself who accepted all that wasn't weak, she was simply unaware of her own value. But awareness changes everything. She begins reclaiming her strength, step by step, breath by breath. She learns that her worth was never meant to be measured through someone else's approval. She learns she doesn't need applause to take up space. She learns she doesn't need anyone to validate her choices, emotions, or existence. She learns she has a voice, not the one she used to mute, but the one that was always powerful enough to shift her whole life if she had let it. Once she recognizes that, a new kind of confidence rises in her. Not the loud, outward type, but a quiet certainty anchored deep within her. The kind that says, I know who I am, and I'm not trading that for attention, affection, or temporary comfort. When she stops negotiating her worth, she no longer accepts half love or half effort. She no longer entertains emotional crumbs offered by someone who doesn't know how to love in full. She stops thinking she needs to prove she's worthy. She doesn't chase clarity. She doesn't beg to be chosen. She doesn't shrink her voice when something hurts. She doesn't pretend to be okay just to keep peace. She stops betraying herself for connection. Instead, she upgrades her standards, not out of spite, not out of ego, but out of self-respect. And that shift changes everything. She no longer gives her energy away to confusion or mixed signals. She no longer tolerates being an afterthought. She stops believing that if she's patient enough, loyal enough, loving enough, someone will eventually rise to the level she deserves. She stops buying into the illusion that she has to earn what should already be freely given. This is where many people misunderstand her. They think she's become cold, but she hasn't. She's simply learned the cost of giving love to someone who doesn't know how to handle it. They think she's become difficult, but she hasn't. She's simply unwilling to carry the emotional weight of people who refuse to carry their own. They think she's become unapproachable, but she hasn't. She simply moved out of reach of those who only valued her when she was easy to manipulate or predict. She didn't become harder. She became clearer. She stops saying yes out of fear of being unwanted. She stops apologizing for having needs. She starts walking away from conversations that drain her instead of trying to fix or soften them. When someone tries to guilt trip her, emotionally pressure her, or convince her she's overreacting, she no longer folds. She doesn't waste her breath arguing about her worth. She simply removes herself from the situation, not because she's weak, but because her peace is now non-negotiable. And here's the part that changes her life the most. She begins attracting completely different energy. Where once she allowed people who were drawn to her softness, but feared her depth, she now draws people who respect her clarity and growth. Where once she accepted inconsistent affection, she now welcomes steady, intentional love. Where once she tolerated uncertainty, she now attracts stability. Where once she fought to keep people in her life, now people fight to stay in hers. Not because she demands it, but because her presence holds value that's impossible to replace. This transformation often inspires others. Friends notice she glows differently. Coworkers see she carries herself with more certainty. Family notices she no longer entertains the same cycles. Even strangers feel the shift, the calmness, the strength, the unshakable self-respect. And the man who once thought he knew her, he feels it too. A woman who knows her worth becomes the biggest mystery to someone who benefited from her not knowing it. Suddenly, he can't predict her reactions. He can't sway her decisions. He can't pull her back into old patterns. He can't rely on her need for approval. He can't use her empathy as a doorway to control. She is no longer the woman he used to shape with guilt or promises or emotional distance. She's not waiting for him to change. She's changing herself. And that makes her unstoppable. One of the most powerful examples comes from a woman who spent years trying to be enough. For someone who kept her at arm's length, she loved deeply, but she also allowed disrespect disguised as confusion. After another broken promise, she finally asked herself, "What am I doing to my own soul by staying in this cycle?" That night, she made a decision. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She didn't try to prove anything. She simply chose herself. She walked away with quiet dignity, not because she stopped loving him, but because she started loving herself more. Months later, she had built a business, rekindled old friendships, reconnected with her passions, and healed parts of herself she didn't even realize were wounded. He came back, apologizing, promising, wanting another chance, but she had outgrown the version of herself that needed his validation. She didn't reject him out of bitterness. She simply didn't belong to that story anymore. That's what it looks like when a woman stops negotiating her worth. She rises into a life that fits her, not one she tries to squeeze herself into. And the world begins to reflect that change. Studies show that people with high self-worth set stronger boundaries, make healthier decisions, and attract more supportive relationships. Confidence isn't just a feeling. It rewires how you show up, how you communicate, and what you tolerate. It shifts your entire reality. She learns that the moment she values herself, life starts valuing her back. She doesn't need someone to choose her. She chooses herself every single day through her actions, her priorities, her growth, and her standards. She becomes the woman whose presence feels like a statement, whose energy feels like truth, and whose life becomes a reflection of the strength she finally embraced. Not because someone handed her power, but because she claimed it. And when a woman finally realizes her worth, she becomes impossible to predict, impossible to control, and absolutely unstoppable. And so she stands unshakable, unyielding, unapologetically herself. She no longer reacts to chaos, no longer seeks approval, no longer sacrifices her peace, no longer measures her growth through someone else's eyes, and no longer negotiates her worth. She has become the woman who cannot be predicted or controlled, not because she's unkind, not because she's cold, but because she finally remembers who she is and refuses to compromise it. Every step she takes, every breath she draws is rooted in clarity, strength, and self-respect. The world may try to push her, pull her, or doubt her, but she moves forward anyway, unstoppable, radiant, and free. And in that freedom, she doesn't just live, she inspires everyone who witnesses the quiet, profound power of a woman who knows her value and will never let it be questioned again.